I want you to move from overwhelmed by information to confident in what really matters. I want to help you move from being unsure towards direction and purpose in your healthcare. I want to introduce you to health experts. I want to let you in on tough conversations on women's health. I want to give you a place where you can lean in and learn how to take care of yourself. Let's transform your health. Let's get clear on your goals. This is Women's Health Unplugged. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Robertson, naturopathic doctor. Welcome to another episode of Women's Health Unplugged. Today's a solo, and so it's just me. I'm Dr. Jordan Robertson. I'm a naturopathic doctor in Burlington, Ontario, servicing women and patients in Ontario, both virtually and in person, thanks to the last year with our transition to virtual medicine. And funnily, we're not quite 18 months into our virtual life with the pandemic, but it's been interesting for me to reflect on just how much my practice has changed. I used to refuse to work with patients that I couldn't see in person for the first time, right? I insisted that first visit always be in person, which meant that sometimes patients were driving, a significant distance for us to have that initial appointment together. And then we would follow up after that by phone or by video conference. And how much things have shifted in the last year where I now have the ability to work with patients all over the province and beyond the borders of the province for some of our other online programming like the Wild Collective, which is our women's health focused program where we move women through sort of an educational and community-based program to help them achieve their health goals. It's amazing the reach that we've been able to have over the last year with both my practice and those programs, given the transition to virtual medicine. So today's episode, we're going to talk about two electrolytes or minerals that you may not be able to rhyme off as being so important as they are. We often talk in health about things like magnesium and calcium, the importance of iron, but these two dietary nutrients that we're going to spend some time on today are maybe the most influential as far as long-term health goes for women. And all patients, actually. So we're going to focus on both sodium and potassium. Now, this is going to bring up a lot of kind of interesting conversation about why we struggle at studying things in nutrition, period. And, the geeky side of my background finds this incredibly fascinating. I will try and spare you some of the details, but the reason that I'm going to talk about it from the context of why things are tough to study is because you can easily find some garbage claims online about specifically sodium. I don't think we have ridiculous claims about potassium floating around online, but there's lots of discussion on sodium, and you can find kind of the earth is flat kind of conversations about sodium online that claim that you need more, you need lots, it's the most important nutrient. And I'm going to share with you today that the actual evidence when we look at longevity and cardiovascular risk, which is truly your greatest health risk in your lifetime, that the evidence is converging on an idea that's the more sodium we have exposure to in our lifetime, the worse we do. And so that's why I'm going to share a little bit about the behind the scenes when it comes to a research perspective. And that's always been my goal really with the podcast, is to shed some light on why internet surfing from a healthcare perspective is a little bit risky, because you can have a blog or you can even write a book that says, eat as much saturated fat as you want. You don't need to exercise. such and such hormone is the problem, when maybe none of those things are actually true, right? It's like the medium that we used to find as being the authority, right? If someone wrote a book about something in the past, like that was just the bee's knees, right? They were just the best that they'd written a book. And now you can write a book about whatever you want and publish it, and it could be complete crap, right? Like, I could literally say, I use the earth is flat conversation, but you could literally say anything, right? Like, hippopotamus can fly. We've just never seen it with our naked eye, but they do. And you could write a book about that. And we see that in nutrition, that we are writing books about flying hippopotamuses and publishing them, and then people are consuming it as if it has the same weight of truth as books did 100 years ago, which if some dude wrote a book 100 years ago, it was like, it was like gospel. So that's why I'm going to throw that into this conversation. And that's really what my entire purpose of the podcast is to give you evidence-informed information about health topics. So we're going to dive in and talk a little bit about sodium and potassium. And let's just take a step back and talk a little bit about what they do in our body and the physiology. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because they honestly do 10 million things, and it's incredibly complicated. I recently spent some time reviewing the influences of both of these nutrients in the kidney as I was preparing for a presentation I did for my colleagues around hypertension or high blood pressure. And I was like, okay, this is like, it's like I'm reading another language. The kidney is cool. Let's just kind of leave it at that. And so both of these electrolytes, sodium and potassium, are incredibly involved in, literally the function of every single cell in our body. But for the conversation I want to have today, they're linked incredibly to water balance in the body. And that's where we look at, the long-term impacts of a high sodium diet or the long-term impacts of a low potassium diet. That's where we're seeing it creep in to chronic disease, is the impact that it has on blood pressure and cardiovascular risk factors. So both sodium and potassium are involved in maintaining fluid balance in our body. Now, you've had these blood tests done probably every single time you've gone to the lab, and they have never been out of range. Okay, so we can't tell if your sodium is high by looking at a blood test, nor can we tell if your potassium is low. So you're going to see the theme of the conversation is that we lean on the sodium, like sodium is too high, potassium's too low in the North American diet. So that's how I'm always going to reference them, is that sodium's too high, potassium's too low. You're never going to find that in your blood work. So sometimes when I'm working with patients and they've brought their blood work to me, perhaps it's been done by another practitioner, they'll say, well, it's good to see that my salt is fine, right? And they point to their sodium that's been tested on their blood work. Now, our body is incredible at maintaining what we call homeostasis, which is where we keep things in a relatively fine, level. We keep certain things at a fine level, because beyond those levels, bad things happen. And the electrolytes in our blood are a perfect example. So yes, your sodium is normal on your blood work, but if you actually looked at the reference range, it's only a few points wide, right? It's not like we have tolerance for this massive changes of sodium in our bloodstream. We actually keep sodium in our bloodstream in an incredibly fine range. And the reason is that it's related to electrical function in the heart. It's related to other life-saving functions that if it gets outside of those ranges, bad things happen. Potassium's the same. If you look at the reference range for potassium in your blood, incredibly narrow range, because it would literally be unacceptable, to the point of death, if we get outside of those ranges. So if those numbers are bold on your blood work, bad things are happening. They're not a reflection of what's going on with your total health. And the reason is that your body will work very hard to keep those levels stable, compromising other areas of your body that don't need those numbers to be quite as stable. places like outside your bloodstream, or the volume of fluid that we carry outside of our bloodstream has tolerance for having high or low levels of sodium or potassium, and we don't die. And so your bloodstream stays in a very narrow bandwidth, and it draws on other areas of the body to maintain that fine balance, right? So if it needs more sodium, it will borrow sodium from other areas of the body. If it needs more potassium, it will borrow potassium from other areas of the body to keep those blood levels incredibly constant. And what that means is we can't measure your sodium and potassium by looking in your blood. There's actually only a very few validated ways of us testing sodium and potassium in the body, or to look at a reflection of, say, what you would intake in a day. And that's actually one of the challenges we face with the research on sodium, is that there's only a couple of really very difficult ways of measuring how much sodium a person is taking in. And most research studies actually don't follow those guidelines. And so their results are kind of, basically they're crap, because they haven't actually assessed the right amount of sodium in the participants that are in the study. But that's kind of a different conversation. But for you, where this is important is that our sources of these nutrients are exclusively from diet, right? We can't make these nutrients out of thin air. We rely on our nutrition in order to influence how much sodium and potassium we have in our body. And we are wired sort of evolutionarily to thrive on a high potassium diet and a low sodium diet. So this was, a reflection of, if we think about our hunter-gatherer style of nutrition, we would have eaten a ton of fruits and vegetables. Okay, so our dietary sources of potassium are fruits and vegetables. For the most part, there's a couple of exceptions of lots of potassium in things like salmon and whatnot. But for the most part, all of our potassium's coming from fruits and vegetables. And sodium was a relative rarity in our diet. So there's a few natural sources of sodium in our diet, but generally speaking, sodium was a thing that we added much later as part of industrialized food chain supply. And it wasn't something that sort of naturally existed in our diet. And evolutionarily, we dealt with the way that our kidneys function because our nutrition was a reflection of the environment, which was high potassium, low sodium. So our kidneys are built to, we call it wasting. So wastes potassium. Our kidneys are built to waste potassium, meaning that we freely excrete potassium to a high degree, whereas there is an amount of sodium that we will resorb, right? So if we thought and really it wasn't completely bizarre that that's what our kidneys did. If something was rare in the environment and yet we needed it, right? We wouldn't want our body to get rid of the sodium. We needed to hang on to some of it, right? We wouldn't make any sense if our body was designed to oh shoot, there goes all the sodium and we're never going to find any of that in our environment again. We actually have the capacity to resorb sodium and hold on to sodium. And so when our diet was abundant in potassium and very low in sodium, this was fine, right? We would keep every scrap of sodium that we ate, and we would freely get rid of potassium because we knew there was a banana right around the corner that we were going to eat, and our potassium levels would be fine. So that's really how we're wired. And we estimate that our sort of hunter-gatherer style of nutrition probably had a sort of 6 to 10 to 1 ratio of potassium to sodium. So we ate 5, 6, 7 times the amount of potassium in a day than we ever ate sodium in a day. And there are still some cultures on Earth that do this. There are some undeveloped cultures on Earth that literally eat zero sodium. And they are, some of the basis of our understanding of what happens with North Americans, where we're exposed to sodium basically since birth, but over our lifetime, that looking back at some of those cultures where they literally have zero sodium intake, that's actually maybe our best global example of what happens if we have no exposure to sodium. So it should be sort of this 5 to 10 to 1 ratio between those two nutrients. And the standard North American diet is actually flipped on its head. So if we think about, so the dietary sources of potassium are exclusively fruits and vegetables. We'll just sit there. There are other sources, but we're going to sit with the fruits and veg being the dominant source. And if you think about the sources of sodium, and it's interesting because people can list sodium sources, but are generally unaware just how endemic it is in their diet. So patients will say, I don't eat a lot of sodium. I don't salt anything. And that's great. However, sodium is in almost every food that you eat that has been touched at some point in time in the food, like in the food chain supply, right? So a food that was put in a box, a food that was put in a little package or a baggie or was made by someone else, a food that was baked like bread, right? Any food that you buy that you do not make 100% with all the ingredients on your own in your own kitchen has some sodium in it. And that means that it is so abundant in our North American diet that even if you never put salt on your food, I would guess that you probably have more sodium than you think. Okay. And even I've read lots of studies about this, but there are studies looking at sodium restriction like from infancy. And I remember when I started reading this study, I'm like, what infants are eating sodium? Like, how can you have a low sodium diet for a 6-month-old? And it's true. Like at 6, there was enough sodium or 6 months, there was enough sodium in the diet of babies that you could have a sodium restricted diet for that age group. Because naturally, if you think about the things that maybe are being fed to, babies between 6 and 12 months of age, some of those things are coming out of a package. Some of those things are not being made by you. And therefore, there is room for improvement as far as sodium goes. So your sodium intake is probably higher than you think. And your potassium intake is probably lower than you think. And given how influential these two nutrients are as far as cardiovascular disease risk goes, this needs to be a conversation that we're having more often. So when we casually tell patients you need to eat more fruits and vegetables, we're not doing a good enough job to say, yeah, this is so that you don't die, right? We're not doing a good enough job at contextualizing it because patients don't smoke, right? Or they don't want to smoke because they can see smoking increases my risk of lung cancer. The difference that sodium and potassium ratio has on your longevity, I'm not going to say it's equal magnitude because I honestly haven't looked up the magnitude of risk associated with smoking in a long time. It is a significant increased risk in your risk of death from cardiovascular disease if these two nutrients are out of balance in your diet, period. We just know it. So how do we come to know this or such a thing? And this is tough. And this is where I'm going to throw in my bit of side science geekiness here. The reason that we have such a difficult time with nutrition research is that it just doesn't follow the kind of research that we look at with drug studies. And we have made drug studies the penultimate gold standard. This is the best way to study things, which is when we give someone an exposure. Okay, we give them a medication and then we watch them for a relatively short period of time to see what happens, right? So if we gave someone a medication or an exposure and they died within 3 months of the study, like, gosh, that would be easy to study, right? It's like, hey, we gave everybody in group A this green pill and like 70% of them are dead. And okay, well, the green pills are bad, right? And so if research all looked like that, like, God, it'd be a lot easier for us to figure out what killed us and what didn't, except that it doesn't really work that way. And so instead of seeing people die in 3 months, right, because that very rarely is going to happen in any kind of study unless we're studying a very terminal illness. In general, then what we're looking for is some kind of flag that this person might die in the future. So instead of that person, dying in the 3 months of the study, and sorry if this is morbid, now we're giving them the green pill. And in the 3 months of the study, their blood pressure is going down. And we go, hey, you know what? If people have high blood pressure, they die more often of cardiovascular disease. And now we gave them that green pill and their blood pressure has gone down. Our conclusion is the green pill lowers blood pressure. And if we had to, hazard a guess, they probably would die less of heart disease in the long run. And that sounds like a pretty reasonable conclusion to make, right? Because we know that blood pressure and heart disease are incredibly linked. And if we find a treatment that lowers their blood pressure, then gosh, we probably can draw maybe a dotted line between blood pressure the green pill and death. But we can see, right? We're converging on an idea that giving this medication is maybe going to have a positive impact on their long-term outcomes. And then we start to study the green pill a little bit longer, right? And we say, well, what happens if we track these people for 5 years? And generally, like most drug trials are kind of maximum going to look at people for a few years, but we're looking at what's called a surrogate outcome, meaning that we're checking a thing that we know is really related to the big thing, which is death. And that's what we're going to measure because we can't follow these people for 25 years to find out if them taking medication for 25 years saves them. And so we're just going to measure their blood pressure instead. When we move into the ideas around nutrition, this is where things get a little bit muddy. And when things get muddy, it makes people on Instagram say that things aren't true, right? And so what I mean by that is that because we can't draw a solid line between the exposure and the outcome, it starts to breed theories that, well, maybe the earth is flat and maybe this thing that that science says is true isn't actually true and we shouldn't believe anybody. And we've all seen those books, right? Like, everything your doctor has ever told you about such and such is wrong. And that, for a person who's been really struggling, trying to find someone to listen to them or take their case seriously, a title like that is really compelling and is really hopeful. But when we're talking about sodium and we're talking about cardiovascular disease, the reason that so if we give people, let me back up for a sec. If we give people sodium for 3 months, nothing happens. I mean, their blood pressure might not even go up in 3 months of giving them a lot of sodium. And why? Okay, think back to the beginning where I said our body's incredible at managing homeostasis. If we give a truckload of sodium to someone, their body compensates and is compensating and is like, man, we have really eaten a lot of sodium, but we need to keep our blood levels stable. And so we're going to work really hard to do that, even though the environment is getting a little bit rocky and tough because we seem to be putting a lot of salt on everything. But your body manages, and it manages for a long time, right? Even if you think about the way that you feel when you've gone through particularly difficult times in your life, right? And you think, oh my God, I couldn't handle one more thing happening. And then one more thing happens and you handle it, right? We are incredibly resilient beings. Your body is incredibly capable of being resilient to a really shitty environment. Even if we put our body in a terrible environment, it keeps adapting. So we don't see change in 3 months. We don't even see change in blood pressure in 3 months. Nobody drops dead in 3 months of having a lot of sodium. Nobody's blood pressure even goes up 3 months after eating a lot of sodium. And when that happens, right, we start to doubt whether or not it's important, right? Well, if we give someone a lot of sodium and nothing happens, and there are some studies like this, okay, let's give these 21-year-old healthy men a lot of sodium and see what happens. Oh, nothing happened. I guess it's fine for everyone. Or we'll pick on a special interest group well, athletes need a lot of sodium and therefore everybody else needs a lot of sodium. And those conclusions that we're making are not true. And they're doing damage because they're making assumptions about what your needs are when your needs are not the same as the athlete. And just because we can't influence blood pressure in a healthy 21-year-old man in one day of feeding him a takeout meal, it doesn't mean that we should all eat takeout meals every single day, right? And if I say it like that, it makes sense. But the sort of naysayers around the sodium thing will say, well, I've never seen anyone drop dead from eating a takeout meal. And so big pharma is trying to get us to eat less sodium when it's not accurate. And it's just not true. So that's my little bit of a rant about the why it's tough to study things in nutrition. So for the most part, nutrition is exposure over time, right? Exposure and dose over time, meaning that, yeah, your body will compensate. If you go away to an all-inclusive, and I'm going to put that out there that hopefully one day we can all go to an all-inclusive, and you eat a ton of sodium for a week, your body will compensate. If you ate like that every day for 3 years, eventually your body's like, man, we have put this sodium everywhere we can think of to try and keep blood levels stable. We have retained a ton of water as a consequence of all of this sodium. We got nowhere else to put it. And eventually, we start to see blood pressure increase. Eventually, we start to see consequences of the repetitive behavior of high sodium diet. It doesn't show up in 3 months. So although our bodies can compensate beautifully, eventually disease process starts, right? If we don't put our bodies in an ideal environment or scenario, eventually the wheels start to fall off the bus. Eventually we start to have so much extra fluid, because what happens when we have lots of sodium is we have lots of fluid. Eventually we see change. Eventually your blood pressure goes up. Eventually you have cardiovascular disease associated with a high sodium diet that you've been doing for a long time. And so it's hard when people get, I'm saying in air quotes, like magically diagnosed with high blood pressure in their 40s or 50s, for them to see their nutrition as an influence, because they're like, well, I've always eaten this way. And it's like, yeah, that's the problem. You've always eaten this way. And 25 years of too much sodium, your body was tapped out and was like, dude, that's it. We can't do anything else with this extra fluid. And now it's in your bloodstream. And now there's an influence on your blood pressure. But it took me 25 years. This is your body speaking. Now I'm speaking in third person for your body. Your body's like, dude, I did this for 25 years. I'm done. And now we have high blood pressure. So yes, you've always eaten that way. It's exposure over time, exposure and dose over time. And so when we look at these undeveloped countries that have zero sodium, they don't have high blood pressure over time as they age. They're the only ones on earth, actually, that don't have blood pressure increases with age. Whereas in North America, we just have this, it's an accepted fact that your blood pressure goes up when you get old. Is it that we're getting old? Like, what is it about aging that suddenly makes our blood pressure go up? Or is it exposure over time? Your life over time eventually means blood pressure increases because compensation fails, right? We can't manage our North American dietary intake for our entire life without consequence. Eventually, there's a consequence. And it's hard to study. And so that's how we get the finger wagging naysayers that say, oh, we don't know. We're not sure if sodium causes a problem. Every single study that has ever looked at sodium intake over time, every country that has put in sodium reduction public health measures have seen an improvement in hypertension or blood pressure and cardiovascular disease over time. Like I said, even studies that study sodium restriction from birth, there was a study that literally looked at it from birth. And at age 15, the group that had been taught to eat low sodium from birth actually had lower blood pressure at 15 than their counterparts who ate the regular diet of that country. So we can see that there is an overtime exposure issue with sodium. And the very best studies that have looked at it, and when I say very best, it means they studied the sodium intake in the best way, which was that they do these special urine collection and they do it over time. They basically found that there was a 17% increased risk in cardiovascular disease and death with every 1,000 milligrams of sodium that was in the diet. So for every increase in 1,000 milligrams, there was an increase in 17% increase in death from cardiovascular disease. Like, hello, right? Like when we think about the impact that this could go back to my smoking example, right? If smoking increased your risk of lung cancer by 10%, you probably still wouldn't do it, or you'd never like go out of your way to start. And then we've got other exposures like sodium that have a defined, really significant impact. And maybe you're sitting back going like, well, how much is 1,000 milligrams? Like the average diet has way more than 1,000 milligrams. When we intervene and try and bring people into a low sodium diet, we're usually talking between 1,500 milligrams and 2,300 milligrams. So the vast majority of public health measures that are related to bringing sodium down is bringing it down. We're like hoping people will only eat 2 grams of sodium. But for every 1,000 milligrams, we see that 20% increase, or 17 in the study, but we're going to round up and say 20. And so there are people that are eating 3,000, 4,000 milligrams of sodium, 5,000 milligrams of sodium every day. And look at the compound risk of cardiovascular disease if we do that over a long period of time. So the research is really clear. Sodium, bad. And there's probably no good or safe level unless you're a special population and you sweat like crazy because you're a high performance athlete. But for the vast majority of people, all sodium bad. Getting the sodium the lowest is the best. Full stop. Now, if we flip over to the potassium side of things, right? So our kidneys are hanging on to every ounce of sodium that we eat, or every molecule of sodium that we eat. And with that, we retain water. So I'm sure you've done the like Friday night pizza, wake up in the next morning and like your face is puffy, right? So we retain sodium and water. We retain water when we eat the sodium. Whereas potassium has the opposite effect. So it actually decreases that fluid volume. I have specifically used sodium and potassium manipulation to make weight for a weightlifting competition, because if we literally just influence those electrolytes in our body, we can lose body water, right? When we're bloated from the pizza, we can have the equal effect in the other direction by using potassium. My guess is this is probably why people feel better when they drink celery water or celery juice. They just don't know that that's why they're drinking celery juice. But because it's a high potassium thing, and we see improvement in body water and bloating, overall bloating. I don't mean abdominal bloating, but like overall bloating when we eat more potassium. That's probably why those people feel better. This is why people feel really good when they first flip to a plant-based diet or when they do a juice cleanse, right? They are dumping a ton of potassium into a very like low potassium body. And what happens is your body like releases extra fluid. You urinate like crazy and get this extra fluid off, and people feel lean and they feel good. And then the moment they go back to their regular diet, they put back on that little bit of fluid retention, right? And weight. So crude weight will go down when you eat a lot of potassium. And we see that in the research studies too. Like people lose weight for the first couple of weeks that they eat more potassium, and then it like balances off because they're not actually losing fat. They're just manipulating their body water. I've done this for making weight, where we eat an annoying amount of fruits and vegetables actually to lose the extra body water. At one point, I had done a sodium potassium thing where I ended up losing like 6 pounds of fluid over 36 hours just by manipulating electrolytes. I didn't track calories. I didn't track anything else. I just tracked sodium and potassium. But it's not sustainable, right? Like eating that's not, I don't do that. I don't, but it does influence body water significantly. And again, if you're thinking exposure over time, right? If you eat a very low fruit and vegetable based diet and you eat a lot of packaged food over your lifetime, right? the influence that this is having on body fluid and extra fluid that you're retaining. And of course, we want to eat fruits and vegetables for a billion other reasons, but that potassium that we take in actually modifies, or it's called a modifying effect of the sodium, meaning that it makes the little bit of sodium that we do have in our diet not so bad if we eat enough potassium. And so that ratio between the two is equally as important as how much potassium or how much sodium you actually eat. So picking up low sodium crackers, but never actually eating the apple, right? You're maybe not doing as good for yourself as you could as if you did both, right? If we dropped the sodium down, but actually ate the amount of potassium that our body is literally craving. We're literally wired to eat all of that potassium. That's where you actually do the best for your body. So potassium is found in fruits and vegetables, and it varies depending on which fruit and vegetable you eat. But for the most part, a cup of fruits and vegetables is going to hang out somewhere in the range of about 200 to 350 milligrams of potassium, depending on which fruit or vegetable you have. And when we talk about blood pressure, we can see a positive impact in blood pressure if people eat about 5 cups of fruits and vegetables per day. So if you take your 250 milligrams of potassium per cup, it doesn't actually take very much potassium for us to see a positive impact, right? What's the math on that, right? It's like 2,500 milligrams of potassium, whereas the ideal is actually to get up in the 3-4 gram range of potassium per day in order for you to have that, positive impact on that sodium balance and then having a positive impact on blood pressure. And so we're kind of probably, and maybe this is where it comes from, looking at that 6, 7, 8 cups of or servings of vegetables and fruits per day in order for us to hit those electrolyte levels that we want to see for optimal health. So really both of those things need to happen, right? We need to look at where sodium exists in your life and in your diet. Think about the percentage of your food that is coming from someone else or that is being made, it's being touched in the process of sort of industrialized food. Somewhere in there, your food is being touched by someone else or a machine, right? If it's being made in a factory, there's sodium there, right? I would argue that almost all of those sources of food have some sodium. And then looking at that number of fruits and vegetables and whether or not you're getting close to that 5-ish cups for bare minimum. I really like that serving size. I think that as a visual is really easy for people to see, that sort of 4 to 5 cups. I think we can get really into the nuances of what a serving size is. Like, is a peach a serving? How many blueberries is a serving? If you can think about things in terms of cups, I think that's a visual that we have a much easier time looking at. And so that's sort of a reasonable goal for most people to start to think about and to talk with their healthcare practitioner about, is like, how can I influence my exposure over time, right? Exposure and dose over time, which is where sodium and potassium are having an impact. And I get it. Like, we have a really hard time as humans setting a goal or making a change where the outcome is 25 years away, right? Like, I'm always amazed at what people can do, like, in a short window of time, right? Like, oh, my wedding is in 7 months and I'm going to X, Y, and Z. And they can see this thing on the horizon, this day on the horizon, and they move towards it like, with vigor. And yet, human behavior is, if the thing is really far in the future, we have a hard time managing how we behave every single day when the outcome is in the future and it's a little bit more abstract, right? When I say, like, decrease your sodium over your lifetime and your risk of cardiovascular disease goes down, like, that feels like a really crappy goal to move towards. And yet, when we poll patients and say, what's your goal, right? It's longevity. They want to live the longest. They want to live the healthiest. They want to live independently, right? Those are the actual big goals, right? We don't want to lose weight for 7 months before our wedding. We want to live the longest. We want to live the healthiest and the most independently. Cardiovascular disease is still the number one health risk of all people. And it's probably significantly impacted by your nutrition choices over time. And so hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight for why this is something to pay attention to. And when we say in general in nutrition, like eat 6 to 8 servings of fruits and vegetables per day, although this is not the only thing we're talking about, right? There are many reasons why we eat fruits and vegetables. There are bioflavonoids and fiber and a ton of things in fruits and vegetables that we benefit from. The thing we maybe have not pointed at enough is the impact that dietary potassium has on your fluid retention, on your future blood pressure, and just on how you feel, right? Like sodium does not make us feel good. Potassium makes us feel better. And so when you flip and turn your diet on its head a little bit and drop the sodium and increase the potassium, the potential there for how you feel is so great. And you can really have such a profound impact on how your body feels, how you move in your body, with respect to like fluid retention. And so it's really worth considering. And I do think that that's a change that people can feel relatively quickly, right? I mean, I told you I lost I don't forget what it was, like 6 pounds of fluid in 72 hours just by eating a lot of potassium. You can feel that relatively soon. The difficulty is latching on to that subtle improvement in how you feel and letting that be the driver of behavior change rather than how much we, love the convenience of the foods that are laden with sodium. So I'm sure there's some balance there because certainly we can't get rid of pizza completely. Um, but looking at the ratio between your diet and the level of it that's coming from processed packaged food, quick grabbed food that's part of the industrialized food chain versus the fruit and vegetable intake. And we probably could all use some improvement there. So, like all of our episodes, and you're going to hear the disclaimer at the end of our episode here, of course, is this is a conversation you have to have with a practitioner, right? There are a couple of special interest groups that benefit from sodium. There are a couple of special interest groups that need to be mindful of their potassium. If you're taking medication for your blood pressure, if you've been identified as having other heart disease like congestive heart failure, you can't just manipulate what's going on with your body, especially if you're medicated, because we've medicated you on the basis of like your lifestyle in part. If you're going to make massive changes to your lifestyle, this needs to be done in a supervised fashion. I would even argue that most people require some kind of strategic support for how they make these kinds of changes in their diet. So talk to your practitioner about it. But the purpose of me having this conversation with you today is to shed light on an area of nutrition and cardiovascular disease risk that we literally never talk about. When I talk about potassium with patients one-on-one, this is not a conversation they've ever had with anyone. Even when I talk to practitioners about potassium, they're like, yeah, you know what? I've never really thought about how important that is. I just tell people to eat lots of fruits and vegetables. But the actual amount that we eat really matters. And when patients hire someone to support them in their health, like, yeah, you want to feel better in 3 months, but you know what? If you kept going the way you were going for 3 months, nothing bad was going to happen. You're probably not going to drop dead. But your actual big goals is longevity, is living well in your body, supporting your body to be functional and mobile and independent and to live with ease into your probably sixth, seventh, eighth decade, right? This is where that starts. This is where you start to build that framework of long-term health is in this conversation around sodium and potassium, alongside other conversations like protein. But this is such an important concept. So, if this is something that's kind of piqued your interest, I would highly suggest that you chat with someone about it to figure out how to make those changes in your life so that it's sustainable and it's something that you can do moving forward. This is one of my favorite topics, looking at sodium and potassium balance, because it's one that we just need to shed some massive light on when we're talking about nutrition. And it highlights some of the great challenges we have in studying nutrition. which I've hopefully outlined for you here so that when you see the naysayer, that's the finger wagger that says that sodium is fine, maybe you can start to see some of the holes in their argument. And that's the purpose of this podcast. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Women's Health Unplugged. My goal is to help you feel more confident about your health. Please remember that what we talked about today in the podcast does not constitute medical advice, nor was a doctor-patient relationship formed. If you have questions about your healthcare or about how today's topic pertains to you, please take it up with your family doctor, your specialist, or someone on your health team.